short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
Kia ora, Alexia Russell here from The Detail. Today I'm talking to two heavy-hitting geopolitical analysts about a subject that's central to the Iran war, and that's the relationship between America and Israel. Why does the United States continually fly to the aid of Israel? And are Americans, in the wake of this and the Gaza war, getting sick of it? Now, my colleague Amanda Gillies has already done an episode on the reasons for the Iran conflict, and that ran on March the 6th, if you want to go back and listen. Spoiler alert, Donald J. Trump's reasons for going in are murky. Israel, on the other hand, sees itself as directly threatened by its near neighbour, and for good reasons. Otago University's Dr. Robert Patman is an expert on foreign affairs, and you would have heard him on the radio every time there's some complex international conflict going on. I just want to concentrate with you on the US-Israel relationship. And I think a lot of Kiwis don't really understand what's going on there, why there's such a close tie there. You know, why does the US have this interest in Israel?
Well, the United States, I think, was one of the first countries to recognise an independent Israel in 1948. And the relationship really steadily developed since the 1967 war. The relationship between the United States and Israel was quite close, but it's deepened over time. And the United States was seen by Israel as an honest broker in trying to resolve the dispute with the Palestinians. And in the early 90s, they made some progress through the Oslo process. The United States, since the mid-90s, has continued to have a very close relationship with Israel, although rhetorically the two countries have somewhat drifted apart. What I mean by that is the United States, until the second Trump administration, had always stood for a two-state solution, whereas Mr. Netanyahu, who's been prominent in Israeli politics for the last 25 years or so, does not want a two-state solution. However, the fact that they disagree on the outcome of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis hasn't prevented the United States getting ever closer. So the United States sees Israel as one of the few democracies in the Middle East region. It sees Israel as a very close strategic partner, and that's represented. I mean, that closeness is symbolized by the fact that the United States provides about $4 billion in military assistance every year to Israel. So the relationship's deepened over time. Interestingly, in terms of diplomatic goals, they had drifted a bit, but with the advent of the second Trump administration, the relationship has got even closer. And Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu seem to have an exceptionally close relationship. Is
that what has done it, the personal ties? Because Trump's sort of withdrawing from the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, no, there's also the Israeli penetration of American domestic politics, which is a crucial factor in explaining the closeness between the two countries. AIPAC, the American-Israeli support lobby, very powerful, influential group in United States politics. The Israeli lobby funds both major parties, Democrats and Republicans, and that's been a factor going back to the 70s, that Israel, I think, realized by the 70s that it actually had to become a player in American domestic politics, and it has successfully done so. Although, interestingly, since the Gaza crisis, AIPAC has become, at least when it comes to funding Democratic candidates for office, has become much less visible, because there is certainly a change of opinion within the United States amongst young people, particularly in progressive politics. And sometimes closeness to AIPAC is seen as a disadvantage, particularly with the ICJ indicating that war crimes were committed in Israel's retaliation to the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. Israel, supported almost unconditionally by the United States, launched a retaliation that killed more than 70,000 Palestinians, including 20,000 children. So for many progressive politicians in the United States, there has been some distancing from Israel.
Was that like a line crossed?
I think it was a catalyst in the transformation of many Americans' view of Israel. And that is evident, for example, in the number of young people in the American military who've claimed conscientious objector status in the current Epic Fury campaign launched by the United States against Iran, along with Israel. There's been a number of people. The information is hard to come by, but all the indications are that a number of people are seeking to effectively seek an honourable discharge from the US military rather than participate in a campaign against Iran in what is widely seen as an illegal war. But I think the trigger for that was probably the Gaza catastrophe, because it was a catastrophe for the Palestinians in particular, with 92% of all buildings leveled in Gaza. So I think that was a bit of a watershed in US-Israeli relations, not so much amongst the political level, but in the terms of the relationship between the two societies, people-to-people relations. And most opinion polls show, for the first time, that after the Gaza conflict, that more Americans are sympathetic to the Palestinians. And there is a perception particularly amongst young people, that the Biden administration, when the Gaza conflict flared up in October 2023, should have been much more measured in its support for Israel and conditioned its military support to Israel observing the laws of war and particularly human rights of the residents in the citizens of Gaza. It's very difficult to get hard evidence on this, but most reports that have been circulated suggest there's unease within the Pentagon. First of all, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, and President Trump haven't got too much respect in military circles. But a bigger factor is that many Americans perceive no clear reason for the attacks on Iran. And it's seen once again as American foreign policy being directed by Israel. Israel was a crucial influence on the Bush administration in invading Iraq in 2003.
In case you don't remember that, the excuse for going in and toppling Saddam Hussein's regime was that he was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. 1,625 UN and US inspectors spent 2 years searching 1,700 sites at a cost of more than $1 billion, and they didn't find any.
In both cases, of course, the American government claims it's acting for its own reasons, but the Trump administration has not been able to articulate a clear political goal for using force.
This morning, the U.S. went to war with Iran, and President Trump's justification for it made no sense.
The confusion surrounding this conflict is growing by the day.
Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world.
It has claimed that it was on the verge of receiving an attack by Iran, but most analysts point to the fact that Mr. Trump boasted after the brief war in June last year, 2025, Mr. Trump claimed he'd obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities.
We wiped out the nuclear capability of Iran, obliterated it. It was obliterated like nobody's ever seen before.
I would say it's set back permanently. That place is under rock. That place is demolished.
They're never going to have nuclear.
And Israel, which also engaged in a 12-day war with Iran last year, claimed it had destroyed half of Iran's missile capabilities. There's little evidence that Iran was on the verge of, or was even capable of attacking either the United States or Israel. So I think this time round, there is a much greater perception in the United States than there was in 2003 of the importance of the Israeli factor in tilting Trump towards military action. It was Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who 2 days into the conflict effectively acknowledged that America was doing this for Israel.
Rubio argued the U.S. had to hit Iran first to head off harsher retaliation on American targets in the region if Israel had attacked alone.
Obviously, we were aware of Israeli intentions and understood what that would mean for us, and we had to be prepared to act as a result of it.
He subsequently avoided a lot of the limelight during this conflict since making that statement.
Robert Patman says it suits Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu politically to weaken Iran, which supports groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen, all enemies of Israel. He believes Iran is the major obstacle to creating a greater Israel. But Trump isn't necessarily on board with that.
There's no evidence to suggest, in my view, that Mr. Trump is consciously supporting Netanyahu's project of a greater Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. But he does value closely the relationship with Israel, a strategic partner, and he doesn't seem to have any serious objections to Israel expanding its influence. But there could be a divergence between the Israeli position on Iran and the United States position. Many analysts have pointed out their objectives have never been identical. The United States does have an interest in degrading Iran's military capabilities because Iran is seen as a threat to many of America's allies in the region, including the Gulf states. At the same time, Mr. Trump, as we saw in Venezuela, may not have any problem with a more cooperative Iran. That is to say, he doesn't necessarily want regime change. He'd like it, but if he can't get it, he may instead go for another option, which is a new Iranian leadership, even if it's a clerical leadership, and work with that if it's on America's terms. Whereas I think Mr. Netanyahu's vision is quite different. He basically he definitely wants a change of regime, but he also doesn't want to see a strong Iran per se because it comes into conflict with his regional ambitions. Whereas I think Mr. Trump could live with a strong but compliant and cooperative Iran.
There's talk now of a peace plan, although it's unclear who America's been talking to. Iran is laughing at it, but even if the US finds an off-ramp for this war, it doesn't mean Israel will also cease hostilities.
Even if the United States reaches an agreement with the Iranian leadership, Israel reserves the right to continue to attack Iran as well as Lebanon. So Mr. Netanyahu's goals are not the same as Mr. Trump's. I think personally that Netanyahu would be hard pushed to sustain two wars with both Lebanon and Iran if the United States reached a deal with a deal for peace with Iran. It may be that Mr. Netanyahu, who's trying to influence members of the American government that may be more pro-Israeli than Mr. Trump is.
Dr. Jeffrey Miller is a geopolitical analyst. He says one of the few certainties in the Middle East is that Israel and the US are in lockstep and have been since the 1970s and before, when President Harry S. Truman was one of the first to recognise Israel as a sovereign state back in 1948. I asked him why the two countries are so close.
I think a lot of reasons. Some of it is based on religion and the idea of Christian Zionism, the belief that the return of Jews to the Holy Land is a biblical prerequisite for the Second Coming. Some of it is just pure economics, and the fact is that the United States gives Israel around $3.8 billion in aid each year. Most of that is military aid, nearly all of it, in fact. And most of it gets spent on American arms and American military hardware. So if you go back to 1961, Dwight Eisenhower, the US president, warned of a military-industrial complex. And in some ways, this is what he was talking about, that you do have a lot of US weapons manufacturers that are very reliant on selling arms, particularly to Israel. It's just one of the staples. So there's religion, there's politics involved with all of that, of course, because the United States, the the Republican Party there relies very heavily on evangelical voters, and particularly from the 1970s onwards, there was a real push from evangelicals to demand really greater support for Israel as part of Republican candidates' platforms, and the likes of Jerry Falwell, prominent Baptist pastor, was part of that. He led a movement called the Moral Majority in the 1980s, and particularly from Ronald Reagan onwards, it's just been a truism that if you want to be successful in politics and you are on the Republican side, you have to support Israel very, very strongly. And even on the Democratic side, that has largely become a truism, that you have to show support and loyalty towards Israel. So going back really to the early 1970s, usually we see the Six-Day War in 1967 as the beginnings of really just very strong US military support for Israel, and a very, very close alignment between the two countries. So it's at least 50 years.
Yeah, interesting though, the Jewish population in the United States is, about just over 2% or something. And obviously Judaism is quite different to Christianity, although they're based in the same history. Is this a case of one country in that region being nearer to Christian America than the other nations?
Yeah, well, that's the way some would see it. And when it comes to Israel, I guess many Americans, particularly at the evangelical side of the spectrum, they see Israel almost as a mirror of America, and you have settler Zionism, and effectively a religious underpinning of settlement of Israel, in much the way that the early founders of America, or many of them, were strongly Christian. So there's a commonality there, I think they see between the two countries, and they've just become very, very powerful. And you had lobby groups beginning since the 1950s in the United States, but becoming much more powerful over time, particularly the 1970s and 1980s. And the one that is usually talked about most is AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which has really become just a very powerful force in US politics on the right because of its lobbying abilities, and because of its ability to make or break candidates. Remember, the United States politics really is about money, and about a lot of it, because you need so much money to win races. You need advertising dollars, and that money has to come from somewhere. And the AIPAC group has become very influential in deciding who gets elected and who does not.
What about individual Israelis? How do they feel about having the sort of American eagle on their shoulders?
Look, I couldn't speak for the average Israeli citizen, but it's a very close partnership with the United States. It goes back, as I said, really to the Six-Day War. After that point, and 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when there was a surprise attack on Israel, it was the United States and Richard Nixon that really got them out of trouble by airlifting tanks and other weaponry to save them. I think Israel, for Benjamin Netanyahu, for many in Israel, not all, but they see the United States really as the only true friend that they can rely on. European countries place far more conditions on support than the United States does when it comes to weaponry. For example, many European countries wound down sales to Israel after October 7th, limited supplies and so forth. The United States did not. So it's a very long-term partnership. It has been for more than 50 years between Israel and the United States, and there doesn't seem to be any real end in sight to that. While attitudes over time do change, and there is a significant sector of the population in the United States that would like to see less military aid going to Israel, around about 40%. That figure grew during the war in Gaza. There just doesn't seem to be any chance of that happening anytime soon. Of all the presidents who probably could have changed the narrative on US support for Israel, Donald Trump probably would have been the one. But despite various statements that he made during the election campaign, and you can find statements that were surprisingly critical of Israel, ultimately he did swinging behind the Republican orthodoxy. And Donald Trump described himself as a protector of Israel and talked about making Israel great again. And he's really stuck to that line with his position on the war. And in many ways, he's gone further than any other US president in decades.
And Robert Patman says Israel's very effective lobbying system and financial support for American candidates across the political spectrum there has penetrated its political system to an extraordinary degree. Democrats as well as Republicans have tended to be very supportive of Israel's foreign policy agenda. But he says in terms of the American people, recent events could see that change.
Let's give you an example of American military support for Israel. In the 2-year war in Gaza, America extended slightly over $21 billion in military aid. And much of the munitions used in Gaza were provided by the United States. And that is why I think there's been a bit of a transformation in how Americans perceive Israel's role. Many Americans were very uncomfortable because of the images projected on the social media of Israel's role in Gaza following the Hamas attack. And that has definitely changed, I think, to a changing perspective on Israel as America's partner. There is a growing perception in the United States that the tail is wagging the dog when it comes to the relationship between the US and Israel. And many Americans are puzzled why American presidents seem to be incapable of asserting American interests if they diverge from that of Israel.
Israel is just used to being in conflict with its neighbours. And the United States, for them, yes, they've been involved in wars in the Middle East, in Iraq notably, and last year in the 12-Day War, but they are not as keen for protracted conflicts in the Middle East. Certainly after the Iraq experience, there is no great appetite in the US public for long-term wars in the Middle East. For Israel, it's more of just a way of life. Unfortunately, they are used to these long-running conflicts, and they are used to fighting in their own national interests. They see it as in their interest to destroy as much as possible in Iran. For the United States, I think the calculus is quite different.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Drs. Robert Patman and Jeffrey Miller. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Gwen McClure. And I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.